All right, so to shed some light on that report, we're heading to Abuja. Makwa?
Oh, yes, indeed. Exams have been conducted and the reports are finally coming out. We have with us this morning Elizabeth Lewis, who's the African Regional Director of the International Republican Institute. Welcome to Sunrise Daily.
Thank you so much.
We also have with us Mr. Chris Fumoyo, who is the Senior Associate West and Central Africa of the National Democratic Institute. Welcome to Sunrise Daily.
Thanks for having us.
Well, I'm looking at this report. The first few lines, let's say the first line of the actual report, I don't know if it's of the press release, says something about this elections fell short of the expectations of many Nigerians. How did you come to that conclusion? Would you like to go first, Elizabeth?
Sure. I mean, I think over the last 20 years of Nigeria's return to civilian democratic rule, we saw incremental improvements in electoral processes kind of culminating in the 2015 electoral process. I think so. There were very high expectations for 2019. And unfortunately, I think that the delay on the morning of the February 16th election, as well as some of the security incidents that were experienced, other technology challenges, and vote buying and things like that that we observed really put a damper on the process. And I think that is what's spurring the conversation this week and in the period since the election about what can be done to improve the process for the future.
Okay. Now, I know that the report you have released isn't just about the 2019 elections. Right. There had been elections, like call them off-season elections, before the actual general elections. And I think that your report built on some of the conclusions you had from those elections. Would you say that we learned any lessons from those off-season elections which, guided the conduct of the 2019 elections?
Well, I think the benefit of having organizations such as IRI and NDI in country is that we have been present in Nigeria for the past 20 years, and we've worked alongside Nigerians to strengthen the democratic process in this country. And so we've had the benefit of watching and observing every election since 1999. For this election cycle, we had 2 pre-election assessment missions that were timed to coincide with the off-season elections in Ekiti State and in Osun State. Yeah. And so we got the opportunity to see INEC innovating some of the changes, improvements that INEC wanted to bring into the electoral process. And I think because those off-season elections happened in 2018, the hope was that by the time we got to February and March 2019, that INEC would up its game, drawing lessons from those off-season elections and performing better than it did in the February and March 2019 polls.
Which was what a lot of Nigerians were looking forward to as well, especially with some of the experiments, experiments was coming up with. For instance, in the 2015 elections, there was an accreditation process first and then a voting later. We understood that in the off-season elections, they experimented with voters, voting at once, being accredited simultaneously as voting. Did you notice any difference? Did you think that that change made a dramatic difference in the outcomes that we eventually saw in the 2019 elections?
Well, that's a very good example that you bring up, and that's one case where INEC is to be commended for having listened to recommendations that were made in the past. And the reason the recommendation was made to merge those 2 activities was because there was a feeling that it was burdensome for voters to first line up just to get accredited till midday and then come back and line up again to be able to cast their ballots. And I think the fact that the 2 activities were then merged made it easier on the voters to go to their polling units, stand in line just once, and get to be accredited and to vote. And I think that if you talk to the voters, as we did during the observation mission, many of them were pleased that they had to spend less time at the polling units because they got accredited and voted at the same time. So, these are steps that INEC can take by itself through its own guidelines to facilitate the participation of Nigerian citizens in their elections. And INEC should be commended when they make those kinds of innovations. They should also be open to constructive criticism that can allow them to continue to strengthen the electoral process.
Well, we did see some political parties kick against that innovation, in quote, because they felt that that was subject to manipulation, especially since perhaps the number of accredited people might not be I don't know, might not tally or would be made to tally with the number of people who have voted. But they had their reasons. I mean, I can't quite remember clearly what those reasons were. Do you think that their positions were justified?
I mean, I think what you have to look at when you're looking at the voting process on Election Day is what makes the process most accessible to voters. I do think that the change in the process to do simultaneous accreditation and voting, I think we did notice that that it did speed up the process for the individual voter, for sure. You didn't have that drop off from people who got accredited and then maybe didn't come back. I mean, elections around the world have simultaneous accreditation and voting, and so I think that it was within the right of INEC to kind of make that improvement, and I do think that that did ease the way for voters.
What would you say was a singular disappointing thing for many Nigerians that made them think these elections did not quite meet their expectations, especially in relation to what had happened in 2015?
I think there were several things. I think kind of all of the court cases that came out of the primary process, that was a challenge. I mean, I think going into even Election Day, people may not have known who was going to be on the ballot in their constituency in some races. And that created a lot of you know, political discussion in the lead up to the election that may not have been on the priorities of citizens, for example. I think also the last minute delay of the process on the morning of February 16th was a challenge for voters. You know, many people, because they're registered where they originate from, many people had to go home to vote on Election Day, and I think in some places people were already queuing on that morning or on their way to the polling station. I know it was the middle of the night, to be able to vote, and then to delay by 1 week, that might have meant that folks weren't able to get back out to the polling stations on the 23rd, 1 week later. Mm-hmm. And I think that was certainly a challenge for voters.
Well, we'll take a break now. When we come back, we'll be focusing a bit more on the recommendations, because the reports are not just criticisms. They come oftentimes with extensive recommendations. We'll sink our teeth into some of them after this break. Please stay with us. Yes, we're talking about the report, the Election Observers Report released recently by the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute as well. And we have with us in the studio Elizabeth Lewis, who's the African Regional Director of the IRI, and we also have Chris Fumonyo, who's a Senior Associate West and Central Africa of the NDI. Now, I'm looking at the statement released, this report. It says the 2019 elections highlighted for many Nigerians the need for a national conversation about the country's democratization since the 1999 transition to civilian rule. This is according to Ambassador Derek Mitchell, who is the NDI president. He says, we hope this report may both spur and contribute to enriching that national conversation. Why do you think that this is bringing to the fore the need to have a conversation on our democracy so far?
Well, we think so. In fact, that was in a letter signed by the presidents of our two organizations, okay, who were both here, okay, during the elections as observers. And the benefit that we have is that both of our organizations were here during the transition in 1998, 1999, and we saw the enthusiasm amongst Nigerians about their democracy. We had a lot of Nigerians talk about the democracy dividend and the expectations that this new dispensation would really help raise the standards of living for citizens, and that democracy would deliver. And now, 20 years down the road, we're not hearing the same conversations. And elections do not a democracy make, but elections are a critical pillar in the democratic process. And if you get your elections right, then there's a high probability that the other pillars of democratic governance, issues of transparency, accountability, fighting against impunity, all of those things can then be better handled. But if you start with not getting your elections right, there's also the probability, the risk, that other pillars of democratic governance could go wrong. And I think Friends of Nigeria, as we see ourselves, should be in a position to, from time to time, raise the alarm bells and ring the alarm bells and say, you know, Nigerians need to take stock of where they are with their elections, have a national conversation, because electoral reform is a cross-cutting responsibility. Of course, it's not just for INEC alone, but it's for the legislators who have to define the electoral framework. It's for civil society, it's for the executive branch, it's for the security services, it's for the political parties who have an important role to play and who so far, in our opinion, haven't really put their best foot forward in terms of their contribution to successful and transparent elections in Nigeria.
I'm looking at what, you know, one of the things you just said now is about having this national conversation about now. The question for me is what exactly is spurring it? If you look at, the 2019 elections, voter apathy was significantly felt during the polls. Would you say that you noticed that, you know, there was that tendency to apathy before the elections themselves, or was this spurred by the postponement that INEC, you know, brought about the morning of the elections?
Well, I think it's a combination of factors. For example, you know, the fact that the country has been on a positive trajectory since, let's say, since the 2007 elections. The elections in 2011 were an improvement over the elections of 2007. The elections of 2015 were an improvement over the elections of 2011. And so there was an expectation going into 2019 that that trajectory would be maintained. But there are a number of indicators that came up in 2019 which should be cause for alarm. For example, in 2015, we didn't have 79 candidates running for president. And the fact that all of a sudden you have 79 candidates running for president.
And 91 political parties.
And 91 political parties just made the task enormously difficult for INEC, created a lot of confusion for the voters, and made it difficult for them to discern which candidates stood for what and what the party platforms meant, and to be able to make informed decisions.
Was that really an issue? Because for a number of Nigerians, they would say it was, you know, a pretty, you know, straightforward race as far as they were concerned. Yes, we had new presidential candidates. Some of them you could consider front runners, but they felt it was a straight horse race between the two major political parties.
Yes, that was the way that voters interpreted, made their interpretations with regards to how they approach the candidacies. But if you look at it from an election administration perspective, that INEC, with 80 million registered voters, had to print ballots on which to put all of these candidates on ballot papers. Just the enormity of the task, in the end, probably wasn't worth the investment. The returns weren't really worth the investment. If you also look at the number of court cases around primaries, the fact that today we still have about 800 cases pending on issues that arose even before election day creates a sense of confusion around the electoral process. That wasn't the case in 2015. We look at some of the incidents that occurred in some of the polling sites with regards to electoral security, and the fact that, you know, there was still violence around elections, whereas elections ought to be a cause of celebration for the country. So, you know, the cumulative effect of all of these indications, I think, warrants that the country really have that national conversation so that electoral reform is not just talked about, as has been the case in the past, but it's actually implemented in a way that enhances citizens' confidence in their elections.
Can you tell us how it is, I mean, in the U.S.? Oftentimes when people talk about, oh, not restricting, we've had a situation whereby we've had just 2 political parties in the country by law. But now the space is open for as many political parties as are interested. You know, we always point to the U.S. as an example and say, you know, yes, there are 2 major parties, but there are other parties as well. How is this managed in the U.S.?
So in the U.S., like other countries, I mean, multiple parties are allowed. In the U.S., we have 2 dominant political parties. There are others, I think, and it's natural for a few select parties to kind of trickle to the top, to have kind of very clear kind of choices of a majority of citizens. I think one key aspect of the reform process that needs to be discussed is kind of what are the requirements for registration of political parties. Because I think the proliferation to, you know, almost 100 political parties, that's a significant number. And that's a lot for INEC and citizens to manage. And so one of the important discussions will be, what does it mean to be a political party? What are the requirements for registration? And then how are those, how is that information and what those parties stand for? How does that reach citizens? It's important that there are other voices in the discussion, and so perhaps limiting the number of parties isn't necessarily warranted, but I think making it so that you have clear choices is important as well, and it's a manageable number.
Okay. Well, my colleagues from Lagos would like to ask you some questions as well.
Okay.
Gimba and Aya.
My question is to Madam Elizabeth, because your joint report has identified irregularities, including the removal of the CJN in Nigeria just before the elections. Now, what do you make of the government's position that clearly says that your report has not in any way put the emergence of President Muhammadu Buhari as the president in the 2019 general elections? What do you make of the position of the government?
So I think that the removal of the Chief Justice was, the timing of that is what our report particularly was focused on in terms of, you know, was that prudent timing in the lead up to the elections to make such a change to the judicial system, and kind of specifically with the number of cases pending in the court system. However, of course, you know, these decisions and kind of the conduct of individuals in a political system are important discussions to have, and it's certainly within the rights of Nigerians and the president to make decisions like this. Our report is simply focused on the timing of such a decision.
All right, let me talk to Mr. Fumonyo for a bit. One of the recommendations, well, one of the recommendations in the summaries says that you talked about improving coordination among stakeholders to increase and deepen voter and civic education, and of course you also talked about marginalized groups. Given that there are many agencies of government, political parties, INEC, all in the process of voter education and all of that, what is missing? What do you think is missing?
Well, before I respond to that, if I could just add to what my colleague Liz said with regards to the position of our delegation, our joint delegation, to some of the statements that have come out. It's true, we've heard people say that you know, we couldn't be critical with regards to the issue of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Liz has explained that very clearly. We've also had people say to us, you've not been as blunt as we would have expected, and that's their own opinion. They're also entitled to that. But I think it's an opportunity for us to clarify very succinctly the role of observers. Yeah. We are, as observers, we're not in this country to certify or decertify an electoral outcome. We're here to observe and to report accurately on what we see and hear around the electoral process. And I think the passage in our report with regards to the Chief Justice captures what we heard in the conversations that we had at the time that that decision was made. We have no dog in this fight. We have to be non-partisan and neutral and objective in our recommendations and our findings, and that's how we conducted our activities. With regards to the stakeholders and the conversations that need to occur, we have noticed in the course of our work that sometimes the stakeholders are talking past each other. For example, INEC has the overall authority to administer the polls, but INEC will tell you that they have no control over the security services, and so cannot prosecute people who are committing electoral offenses on the spot, even if those things have been done at the polling units. We talk to political parties, and they say, oh, you know, part of the problem is because INEC registered so many parties on the eve of the elections. But you talk to INEC, and it's not INEC's responsibility to refuse registration for parties that seem to be duly constituted. In fact, in some cases, INEC is ordered by court decisions to register certain political parties. And so we feel that if all of these stakeholders to get into the same conversation, then they may even have a better understanding of the roles and responsibilities of each one of them, and therefore be better apt to play as a team in working for meaningful and credible elections here in Nigeria.
Just as your closing remark now, what would you say is the key recommendation? I know you're making recommendations spanning legal, administrative, even voter civic education and things of the sort, but what would you say if you were to speak to INEC or speak to Nigerians in general, is the key recommendation you'd like them to take away from this report?
For me, the key recommendation would be that electoral reform needs to happen now. to better lay the groundwork and the foundation for better elections in 2023. Electoral reform needs to happen now because Nigeria has gone through a number of review processes. The UWES Commission, the Kendemani Committee, and they have come out with wonderful recommendations. And if only those recommendations were to be implemented now in a timely fashion so that all the stakeholders, including political parties and even citizens, have 3 years, 3.5, 4 years to inform themselves and imbibe the principles embodied in those recommendations. Then by the time we get to 2023, the legal framework is understood by everybody, the rules of the game are understood by everybody, and my sense is that people would rise to the occasion and will perform better than we've seen thus far.
You want to add to it? I mean, especially in the light that I understand that, the government in power is receiving a report with some reservations.
Well, I mean, our report is out there to provide, our independent view of the process, along with, colleagues from other international missions and the domestic observers who are here. I agree with Chris that, the rules of the game just need to be set well in advance so that citizens can receive critical voter education about those new rules, that political parties can register and submit candidates according to those rules, and that, the rules of the game are well known for everyone well in advance, and that INEC has time to prepare according to that legal framework. And so I think that it's really important that this discussion is happening. I think it's prudent that it's around the 20th anniversary of Nigeria's democracy, and we're looking forward to kind of how that discussion plays out and looking forward to 2023.
Well, it's definitely an ongoing conversation. As long as we are in a democratic dispensation, we know that this conversation will be ongoing because the democratic experience needs to be strengthened for all Nigerians. But we must thank you most kindly for coming on Sunrise City this morning. Elizabeth Lewis is the African Regional Director of the International Republican Institute, and Chris Fomoyo is a Senior Associate West and Central Africa of the National Democratic Institute. Thank you again for coming on Sunrise City.
Thank you for having us.
The program continues in a moment. Please stay with us.